very much for still being there with us. Professor Attahiru Jega, former chairman of the Independent National Electoral Commission, INEC, is with us. We told you earlier we shall be looking at issues in electoral reforms. Thank you so much, Professor, for being here with us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, Prof, you've been there, so we'll be delving in on your experience as the INEC chairman and how you worked it out. The election that was conducted under you was considered as a very something close to free and fair when the incumbent president lost an election. So today, Nigeria is trying to do something about the Electoral Act to ensure that we have a better election going forward. But there's an issue that is generating controversy now, the issue of electronic transmission. First of all, how did you receive that debate at the National Assembly when it happened, when the Senate in particular had added a clause to electronic transmission saying INEC would have to get NCC's approval and also come back to the National Assembly for approval if it has to do electronic transmission of election?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. And you see, most countries in the world try to increase or improve the integrity of elections, because the integrity of elections is key to deepening democracy and sustainable development. So increasing use of technology is global best practice in order to improve the integrity of elections. So in Nigeria, we have tried to introduce technology on an incremental basis. We started with the issuance of the smart card reader as voters card. Then it was upgraded to the use of the card reader for verification. Clearly the logical next step is to improve the integrity of the transmission of results. And countries that are not as endowed or as developed as Nigeria, even here in Africa, are using electronic transmission of results. In Nigeria, we are aware, we know that one of the easiest ways politicians change results is when you begin to physically move the result sheets from the polling units to the ward collation centers up to the constituency collation centers, because they can waylay officials moving this, or they can collaborate with some crooked officials to change the results. So really many of us were looking forward to ensuring that by the next electoral cycle in 2023, we would have another upliftment of the use of technology in the Nigerian electoral process, which is the use of electronic transmission of results. So to be honest, I was dumbfounded when I heard that the Senate had, on the one hand, under Section 50, subsection 2, on the one hand, approved that INEC can use electronic voting. But then under the same clause, said that provided that there will not be electronic transmission of results. And I think I couldn't understand how anybody could do that, because I don't think anybody can do electronic voting without electronic transmission of results. In any case, in many countries, they take it a step at a time. You begin with electronic transmission of results, you improve the integrity of the process, and then subsequently you start electronic voting. And the electronic voting requires more infrastructure, not only technological infrastructure, including electricity and other things. So it's a bit more sophisticated than electronic transmission of results. So I think the National Assembly should review that provision, because there is, and I understand there is still scope for doing that, because the House and the Senate will now have to reconcile and harmonize their provisions. We need to go in the direction of electronic transmission of results. When I was chairman of INEC, we started piloting electronic transmission of results after the 2011 election. If my memory serves me well, I think we started with one of the governorship elections, I think in Cross River at that time. You know, and the INEC has been improving on that. And as we saw recently in some of the governorship elections, INEC has done commendably well in terms of really having a robust system of transmitting results electronically, and real time. People can monitor the news agencies like you can follow as the results come into the collation center and are tabulated. And there are also ways of interrogating the data if there are any doubts about the credibility of the results that are uploaded. You know, so all this talk about we don't have the capacity, INEC has the capacity to do this. And also all this talk about NCC saying one thing now, contradicting what they said from what we have heard, both from INEC and from those involved. As far back as 2018, NCC had collaborated with INEC to do an assessment as to the technological framework for rolling out the electronic transmission of results. And it was very clear that there was that capacity even then. And many of the service providers and the operators had assured INEC that they would fully collaborate the way in which they have been collaborating with JAMB and so on for their tests. You know, so I think the question we should be asking, what do we need to do more to improve our infrastructure and facilities to help us use this technology? And we still have 2 or more years to 2023. Not to say that we don't have the capacity and we're not even going to try it. So really, I think if we are to give members of the National Assembly the benefit of doubt, maybe one can say that they did not carefully think through the issues when they took the decision that they did. So I think that decision should be reviewed.
Well, that probably just takes me to my next question, because the question of thinking through the issues is what many Nigerians ask, because there were public hearings before we got to this stage. There were public hearings by the joint committees of the National Assembly on Electoral Amendment, and positions were canvassed. The INEC was there. INEC told them their capacity, and that was why when the decision was taken, the question was, in your opinion, do you think it's more about political self-interest of the lawmakers, or is it about any sense of validity to the reasons they canvassed for voting against e-transmission of results?
Well, I would hope, as I said earlier on, giving the National Assembly the benefit of doubt, that they just did not have the time to think through the issues and the pros and the cons of the decision that they have taken, because I'm hopeful that they would review that decision. But otherwise, if they leave it the way it is, no doubt people will have legitimate reasons to argue that maybe some of them would prefer the old system, which is very fraudulent and through which they would continue to exploit the system for their own selfish interests. I hope that is not the case. I hope they will think through the positive things that we require in terms of improving the use of technology to improve integrity of elections in our country, and I hope they will review this decision and change it.
Talking about thinking this decision through, you know, since this debate happened and the positions were taken by the 2 chambers of the Assembly, even on this show, consistently on a daily basis we've talked about issues. We've brought people, the lawmakers themselves, NGOs, INEC officials, including you today, still talking about the importance of electronic transmission. So one would assume that by now, at least the leadership of both chambers would have listened. But if you listen to the narrative that they're giving, if up until 2 days ago, yesterday, they're still trying to justify why the decision was taken. Now, some of the reasons they canvassed is first that because there's not enough network coverage in some of their areas, that their people will be disenfranchised. You're going to say whether this is a valid argument or not. And then even the Speaker of the House actually made a statement a few days ago talking about even the card reader in question that has failed to authenticate the fingerprints of some people during electronic voting is one flaw that they believe that if you deploy electronic transmission, you may have even greater flaws towards elections. Is there any valid defense to this?
No, to be honest, first of all, who said that everything has to be 100% for it to be used? So the fact that you cannot deploy electronic transmission 100% means doesn't mean that it cannot be done. In fact, probably there is no country that actually uses electronic transmission 100%. But if you can do it 80% or 90% or more, the areas where you cannot reach, you can still transmit results manually. But you have improved the process remarkably in terms of the speed with which results are collated, in terms of the accuracy of the results and the lack of interference in the transmission of results in this 80 or 90% of the areas that are transmitted. So this argument about it has to be perfect before we can do it really does not arise, and there is no correlation or relationship between the card reader which does authentication and the transmission of results. The card reader authenticates a person when he or she comes to the polling unit to say, I want to vote, I am a registered voter. And then the card reader will verify, and authenticate the person. But transmission of results is once the elections have taken place and the results are declared at the polling unit, then how do they get to the ultimate place where they are collated? And we know that presently it's manually done. You have to take it from the polling unit to the ward collation level to the local government to the constituency level, whether it's Senate House, depending on the constituency. If it is presidential, then it keeps going until it ends in Abuja at the headquarters where the collation is done. But if you do electronic transmission of results, this is automatic. As soon as the results are finished at the polling unit, you send the results. Whether by telephone or by computer or by whatever, there are multiple ways in which you can do this. And the concern worldwide about use of technology is the possibility that some people will hack it. But cyber security. Yes, but cyber security. But there are excellent, robust cyber security softwares that many countries are using. So because you are afraid that the results may be hacked, you cannot indefinitely say you cannot do it. The key issue is to be positive, to say, okay, we want to do it. How are we going to look at the software and technologies that can protect what we are going to do? And INEC is capable of doing that. INEC has been doing that as they have piloted this electronic transmission of results that they have been doing.
Some have said in staggered elections. So when there's a general election, the capability also
the capability will be there. Everything you have to start piloting is from small piloting that you develop the capability to be able to do globally or nationally. So frankly, I think the fears are misplaced. If we do proper cost-benefit analysis of the incremental use of technology, in this case particularly the need to deploy electronic transmission of result, we find that the benefits far outweigh the costs and whatever fears we have.
All right, Professor, we know that the Constitution provides enormous powers to INEC to independently organize elections across the country. These powers sometimes are circumscribed by subsidiary legislation such as the Electoral Act. How were you able to manage that situation where you have a reform-minded INEC ready to take on challenges, bringing innovation to the process, and a situation where, say, the National Assembly feels you are moving too fast, take it slowly. How were you able to manage that?
Well, you see, an electoral commission has to operate within the existing legal framework. But an electoral commission needs the capacity to interpret the legal framework and then to know how it can comfortably operate within that legal framework, which means you must have sound legal advice to know that when you take a decision, it's unlikely to be challenged, and if it were to be challenged, you are on solid legal ground. So once you do that, then really you just focus on the job and you do it. If somebody challenges it, you go to court, and then you have a good legal team that can defend the action that you've taken. But again, as I said, fear should not prevent you from doing what you think is right, provided you know that you are operating within the legal framework. This issue, and thank you, you raised it earlier, I did not address it, of now saying that, well, you can do electronic transmission provided that NCC says that it can be done and the National Assembly approves. It's a terrible impingement on the relative autonomy of INEC as provided by the existing legal framework.
Yes.
Just as you rightly pointed out, the Constitution provides relative autonomy. We are not talking about absolute autonomy, no. But certain institutions like INEC in the governance sphere require relative autonomy because they are supposed to do things that are not partisan, so that you can prevent encroachment of partisan interests and other interests into the decision-making processes. So to now say that it is a decision of INEC with regards to the preparation and conduct of election is subject to verification by an agency that is under a minister who is under the presidency. Even if they were to do their job sincerely, it will still create doubts politically about what the intention is. And these kinds of things should be avoided, particularly when we are trying to make our elections to uplift the standard of our elections to the extent that it can help consolidate and deepen our democracy. So these are things that should really be avoided. Again, that's why I said I don't think these decisions are carefully thought out. Because if they are carefully thought out, our legislators ought to know that a constitutionally given, an institution like INEC that constitutionally has been given autonomy with regards to preparation and conduct of its elections cannot now be subsumed under a federal agency, supervised by a minister, even though they have a board and they have their own laws.
That would mean circumscribing the powers of INEC.
Absolutely, because and it will create all sorts of insinuations and interpretations which ought to be avoided.
They ought to know is the word, and many people are wondering why now it was not carefully thought out, because this is an institution. The National Assembly is an institution created by the Constitution itself.
Absolutely.
And so one believes that if you are a lawmaker, then you should know the provisions of the law, and without attaching those caveats. But
I try to be fair.
Yes.
The members of the National Assembly have a lot of work to do, and as you have seen, they were rushing things to go because they are going to go on recess. So when you try to rush things, you have no time to really think through some of these things, especially when you are dealing with. So I give them the benefit of the doubt because I'm hopeful that they will go and review some of those decisions. Otherwise, then they easily now fall into what people are saying, that is self-serving.
Yeah, let's address this your hopefulness, you know, or your optimism that at the harmonization table, you know, we are going to look at it critically again. Now, we saw what happened with the PIB, and no one could say it cannot happen. Really, anything can happen during the harmonization. It may end up the way of the Senate, like the PIB ended up with the way of the Senate, which is also a subject of debate even after it has been passed. But my question to you now is, considering the independence, you know, of the INEC, which was given to it by the Constitution, if it goes the other way, and the position of, you know, the Senate, for instance, is carried at the harmonization table, saying, okay, this caveat will be there, you go to NCC before you come back to, does INEC, as empowered by the Constitution, have the powers to go against it, or is there anything else INEC can do to, you know, get back its powers? You know,
you see, I'm not a lawyer, but at least I have read the Electoral Act as it is, and the Constitution relating to powers of INEC, and I think I have a fair understanding of that. I think on this matter, subjecting the decision of INEC to NCC or even to the National Assembly on the matter of preparation and conduct of election, I think goes against the grain of the constitutional provisions, you know, and I think that INEC would be on solid grounds, in my view, to have a good legal team and to contest that provision if it comes, if it happens, you know, to go and get judicial interpretation as to whether really this can be done. I don't think it can be done. If these kinds of things are done, then the little autonomy granted to INEC to be able to do a good job is being systematically eroded. You know, so my advice will be that INEC should have a good team, and I believe they do have a good team, legal team. And if the National Assembly insists on this, which I think would be indefensible, then obviously this is one of the things that they need to go and seek for judicial interpretation.
All right, Professor, let's talk about the challenge of managing a multi-party system, election management at this level. I think it started during your time, multiple political parties, so many of them, the ballot papers had to be quite low. It was quite ridiculous in the 2019 election. I mean, we had a bunch of 90-something political parties. How challenging was it, using your experience, how challenging could it be in this circumstance to organize an election?
Well, obviously it's very challenging, you know, but we are not the only country that has multiplicity of political parties. What we need to do is to look around the world and see what are the global best practices of managing an electoral system in the context of multi-party system, but particularly with very large number of political parties. And many countries establish a threshold. You know, people are free in terms of freedom of association and other constitutional provisions to register political parties, you know, but it is not every political party that can field their candidate. There have to be certain thresholds that a party must meet before it can field their candidate. You know, in the case of Nigeria, every political party, and some of them are indeed briefcase political parties, you know, would field a presidential candidate, you know, and they have to be put on the ballot because they are a registered political party. And then it complicates the balloting process because we have not established threshold of identifying which party can field their candidate, which cannot. And we can do this. It's done in many other countries. One of the thresholds is, for example, you have to win a seat, but if you win a seat, if it is in the local or state parliament, then you can field candidates to the national parliament. But for the presidential seat, you put additional thresholds. You have to mobilize registered voters in constituencies, a percentage, you know. So that's how you create thresholds. So it's not every Dick, Harry and Jack of a political party that can field a presidential candidate. Otherwise, the ballot paper would be unmanageable, especially in a country like ours, where we have to put so many security features and we are unable to print the ballot papers within the time we needed them and the quantity we needed. So we have to go abroad to print ballot papers. So if you have that kind of unwieldy number of parties on the ballot papers, it becomes very, very complicated. So far, INEC has managed it. Our law presently gives INEC the power to review political parties after elections and to deregister some parties. But if
which it has done.
Yes, which it has been doing. Of course, parties will go to court. Luckily, this time around, the courts have stood by INEC that they have complied with the constitutional provisions. Yes. But if we create the thresholds, a party can exist and be busy in a local government election in a particular state. It doesn't have to field candidates, or a party will be concerned about environmental issues and will focus on only states where there are environmental issues. But to say you want to be a governor, you want to be a senator, you want to be a president, you must meet certain thresholds before you can field a candidate for elections to those positions. And these are the kinds of things one would have wished are also in this new Electoral Amendment Bill. Because unless we do that, then obviously the issue of registration of parties seems to be made easier. So any party that can raise, I think, 1 million or so and constitute executive committees with a national spread and so on, and an office in Abuja and some of those things has to be. In fact, the law said if they are not registered, I think within a month or so, automatically is assumed that they have become registered. So you will have many under the existing legal framework. There will be many more political parties by the next election. The issue is, do you allow every political party without any qualification to field a presidential candidate or a governor? So these are issues we need to interrogate and also have a legal provision that can sanitize it.
Let's look at the issue of electronic transmission again, and of course electronic voting this time. You talked about the length of the ballot paper and how much it takes to print ballot papers, and you even have to go outside the country to print that. So how would electronic transmission and electronic voting really address this problem?
No, it is very simple. Remember, we are talking about results that are tabulated. And the electronic transmission software has the capacity to collect results regardless of the number of parties. So long as people have voted and so long as the ballots can be counted. I mean, the number of once there is a ballot paper and the candidates are listed, you tabulate the results at the polling unit. And you can put in the software with regards to electronic transmission, so that as people vote, if it is electronic voting, automatically is tabulated into the parties that the people have voted for. So really, technology has gone so fast that these things that we think are difficult are very easy to manage.
I think
the problem with the ballot paper we are talking about is the size. It even confuses the voter.
Absolutely.
But if it is electronic voting, it will be on a machine, and if you know the symbol of the machine, you can vote. It will still confuse if you have 100 or 90 parties or 70 parties. So the fewer the parties, the better. But it has nothing to do with the process of transmission of results. Once the elections have taken place, the results will be transmitted, whether you are doing electronic voting or not, whether you are just doing electronic transmission. It is very easy to do that. It's not
I think the context
really
in which
problem.
Yes. A lot of people will think so too, but I think the context in which you raised was data management. If you're talking about, say, 90 political parties, for instance, contesting for a president, with each of them having a presidential candidate, you have to impute all that data into the Z-pad of INEC, for instance, the result for each political party, and it increases the volume of data you're dealing with, in which you have to transmit, and also the level of encryption that is required to transmit that volume of data. And I think the concern was, would it also not create further, complexities in managing that kind of volume of data?
No, there is no doubt it will create complexity. But with regards to technology, the management of that complexity is simple. Once you have a robust software and hardware, that can do this processing. We remember, as we speak now, in 2015 elections, we had about 93 or so political parties. By 2019, they had come down to, I think, 73 or so. So our hope is increasingly we would have less and less number of political parties, and the less the better. And that's why I said I had expected in this new electoral bill to have thresholds for contesting elections. If it were local elections, it's not a problem actually. Yes. But when it becomes a presidential election, when virtually everybody is voting from everywhere for those candidates, that's where you need to really sanitize it, because they don't field candidates in every governorship election or in every senatorial election and so on. But presidential election, every political party wants to be visible, and if you don't have a threshold, everybody will field their candidate. Some, as we saw in previous experiences, you are a presidential candidate but you have only 200 votes nationwide. So really it doesn't make sense. That's why there have to be thresholds that can ensure that only serious parties who have the capacity and the ability to mobilize support are actually the ones that field candidates, particularly at the highest level, which is the presidential system.
I'm going to ask you this because you've been there as the chairman of INEC, and how independently you were able to perform. Because we had Pa Ayokpadukun here sometime last week on this program, and even though he raised issues about electronic transmission, saying Nigeria to him is not ready for that, but he did say something about the Justice Uwe's report, which suggested that INEC chairman shouldn't be appointed by the president, that would also guarantee the independence of the electoral umpire and ensure that nobody interferes with their activities. Now, having been there, and now the Electoral Amendment is going on, do you think that should have been part of it, really? Does it affect your position in any way when you're acting as an umpire?
You see, I think the logic of trying to protect the appointment process is not so much the reality, but also to minimize the perceptions that will go along with it. I was a member of the Justice Muhammad Uwe's Electoral Reform Committee, so I was fully supportive of that recommendation that we should insulate the appointment of the chairman of the Independent National Electoral Commission, at least, preferably even all the members of the commission, and the best way to insulate it, in Nigeria, as in many other African countries, there is this deep perception that he who pays the piper dictates the tune. So no matter how sincere a president is in selecting a chairman of an electoral commission, and no matter how independent a chairman proves to be in his work, people will still perceive that is he not appointed by so-so person, he may be doing his bidding. So if you protect the appointment, and that's what the Uwe's committee saw, and in many other countries that is what is done. You have an independent body, independent of the presidency, that will screen either applications or nominations, that will shortlist, and then that will now send a shortlist for Senate confirmation. That's what they do in Kenya presently. They have a robust, although in Kenya it's not the judiciary that does it like Uwe's recommended, but the parliament does that. So by the time a chairman emerges, nobody will say he's been appointed by the president. He could go there and do everything to the best of his or her ability, independent of the person who nominated him. But when push comes to shove, people will still say they will have that perception. So that's the idea about insulating the Electoral Commission from appointment by the president. So Uwe's recommended that the National Judicial Council should be the institution that that should receive applications and nominations for the position of chairman of INEC, that should do a shortlist and maybe even do interviews if it becomes necessary, and then sends names, recommended names for screening and final approval by the National Assembly, which certainly will be better. You know, it may not be as good as they do it in Kenya presently. You know, so really, these are ways that people are saying, if you have a country where elections are very challenging, and where there are all sorts of interest and negative perceptions, how do you insulate that position and minimize the negative perceptions that may affect even the good work that is done?
And deliberate actions as well that can be taken to provide a semblance that there is fairness and integrity in the system. Thank you so much, Professor Jega, for being on our program. Professor Attahiru Jega, former chairman of the Independent National Electoral Commission, been weighing on the issues of Electoral Amendment Bill that is currently generating a whole lot of thought and conversations, in fact controversies in the country. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. We focused more on electronic transmission, but there are two other issues which are critical, which members of the National Assembly need to address.
The finance,
the issue of campaign finance.
Absolutely.
They are turning our democracy into plutocracy. Only people who have money now will contest the elections, and really this needs to be revised. There is also the issue of how some candidates now are putting guns on the heads of returning officers and forcing them to declare results. INEC should be given the power to review those provisions.
Absolutely.
But the way it is passed now by both chambers, that was not captured.
That was not captured, regrettably.
Anyway, those are things that we'll continue to interrogate, and hopefully we'll have you here some other time.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jega.
And I think more to come on the program. Still talking about electronic transmission of results, our group has actually written to